did you have for breakfast this morning? Cheerios, toast, a bagel, berries and yogurt? I had coffee, lots of coffee. Ever wonder where the ingredients originate from? Why do we eat what we eat? That's the subject of today's lecture, The Columbian Exchange, Plants and Animals, or Flora and Fauna. Can you imagine life without chocolate? Italian food without tomato sauce? And Indian curries or Chinese Szechuan dishes without the spice of chili peppers? Florida or California without oranges? The Caribbean without bananas? The Canadian prairies without wheat? Or Hungarian food without paprika, which is made from ground capsicum or bell peppers originally from Bolivia? All of these foods and the places they are now grown are the result of the Columbian Exchange that began with the 1492 exploration by Columbus and his accidental discovery of the West Indies, called West because he was actually looking for the East. On the annual fleets from Spain, Portugal, and later the Netherlands, France, and Britain came fruit trees and seeds to grow pears, apples, and bananas, or sugar cane, or to bring over cows, horses, and sheep. And in the ships on the return voyage went cassava, corn or maize, cocoa for chocolate, tobacco, tomatoes, and potatoes. As in the last lecture on the Columbian Exchange, Disease and Population, the theme and title of this lecture is taken from an influential book by Alfred Crosby entitled The Columbian Exchange, Biological and Cultural Consequences of 1492. Today we focus on the plants and animals, or flora and fauna, exchange between the two continents and beyond. What is the global impact on food production, on the ways of life of the indigenous peoples in the Americas, on Europeans, on Africa? The effects extend as far as Asia. Let's look first at livestock. What livestock heads to America on the galleons across the Atlantic? Horses, donkeys, oxen, cattle, pigs, sheep, goats, and chickens. The European livestock adds to labor power. There is no longer a need to rely solely on human energy and manual labor to clear land of forests, to plow fields, or to build. Oxen or donkeys or horses can act as beasts of burden, carrying heavy loads. Horses can help herd cattle and sheep, can be used for speed in hunting. Think of cliches of cowboys and Indians, and try to imagine the Sioux Indians of the American plains without the horse for hunting buffalo. Horses can also provide quick transportation for a single rider or a wagon. Sheep, goats, or cows produce milk for dairy products that provide protein and last longer without spoilage than simple milk. But they also graze pasture or even overgraze in certain areas and cause soil erosion. Animals like pigs are a walking, mobile, fresh food source. Chickens too, and with the extra protein provided by eggs. In terms of livestock to Europe, I'm not really sure it was a fair trade. Let's see, buffalo or bison, turkeys introduced to Europe. But I guess the Europeans consoled themselves by taking control of the Americas as their own property and changing the landscape with both introduced animals and plants. So if we look at the plants that went to America, again, pretty familiar. The two most important really to pay attention is sugar from Madeira and the Canary Islands, the short stop on the way across the Atlantic, about 10 days sail from Spain, and of course cotton. And these two cash crops will become the basis of the slave trade. To Europe, we see corn, potatoes, tobacco, pepper, beans, squash, tomatoes, cocoa, peanuts, pineapple, squash. In terms of changing the landscape, think of the monoculture plantations across the Caribbean islands and later the American South to grow cash crops such as sugarcane, cotton, and tobacco that could be sold for a profit back to Europeans. These cash crops drove the slave trade from Africa and the exploitation of human labor for monetary gain. Sugarcane is the most striking example of an old world crop that came from the Spanish Canary Islands on the second voyage in 1493. By 1509, enslaved Africans were being imported to Santo Domingo, modern-day Dominican Republic, to produce, cut, and crush sugarcane. And by 1516, sugar was being exported back to Europe, at first as a medicinal ingredient. That's 16 years from the import of the plant to the export of sugar as a cash crop and the establishment of the transatlantic slave trade. That is alarmingly efficient. If we look at plants to Europe, all top 10 consumers of potatoes are Western and Eastern European nations, like Belarus, Latvia, Estonia, and of course Ireland. The top 9 consumers of tomatoes are Mediterranean or Middle East countries in the Old World, such as Greece or Italy. Only Cuba in the New World, where tomatoes originate, is the 10th highest consumer. We can also look at plants to Africa, because the Columbian Exchange is also crucial to food production in Africa to this day. Potatoes, corn or maize, and cassava or manioc, and sweet potatoes increase the caloric intake. They increase the number of calories a person can consume each day, and they become a staple. All top 10 consuming countries for cassava are now in Africa, none in South America. Corn becomes a staple crop in Africa. In the African nations of Lesotho and Malawi, maize or corn provides about 1,500 calories a day to each person. The irony is that these new world crops fed an African population and boosted the African population, and these Africans would end up on the slave ships headed for the Caribbean or Brazil to produce sugar between about 1500 and 1800. In this image, we can see the crops grown by Algonquian Indians near the English colony on Roanoke Island in Virginia around the year 1590. So at the top, we see the planting of corn and the corn seeds, with an Algonquian Indian stationed in a little hut, kind of like a scarecrow, to scare away the crows and prevent animals from eating the corn seed. And we see the stages of growth below of the maize or the corn until it will be ready to harvest. At the top of the image, we see tobacco growing, a whole field of tobacco. In the middle, lots of pumpkins and squash. And here on the side, we see the familiar sunflower with their beautiful flowers turning to face the sun, tournesol, and being available for the seeds and to produce oil, cooking oil. To think about the impact of the Columbian Exchange, we might read this 1659 book called Panacea, or the Universal Medicine, being a discovery of the wonderful virtues of tobacco taken in a pipe, with its operation and use both in physic, that means medicine, and chirurgy, surgery. What are the long-term effects of the Columbian Exchange? In 1500, Europe had a trade deficit, importing luxury goods from the East, but producing few exportable goods in return. By 1750, however, Europe had a trade surplus, exporting far more goods to Asia, Africa, and the rest of the world than it imported. The key reason for this dramatic shift, many argue, was the discovery and exploitation of the Americas, its gold and silver mines, its newly planted cotton, its newly planted sugarcane in all of those plantations. Again, what are the long-term effects of the Columbian Exchange? The rival European powers fighting over the Americas, and later Australian and New Zealand, created a global trade in the centuries after 1492. Portugal, Spain, the Dutch, Britain, France. The cash crops that made Europe rich were not basic foodstuffs, which have finite markets. There were goods that could be and were consumed in large quantities. For example, luxuries that became basic commodities. Try to live without sugar, tea, coffee, and maybe now we can live without tobacco. These changed the lifestyles of most Europeans. And cotton helped fashion itself to become a commodity and not a luxury. So what are the long-term effects of the Columbian Exchange? That is surely a question for discussion.